Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really drilling down into a topic that I think a lot of people are honestly just too afraid to touch.
Oh, absolutely. It's a third rail kind of topic.
Right. But we're asking a question that I think a lot of men out there, especially if you are a competent, rational guy who feels like you've been, I don't know, waking up in an alternate reality for the last decade, you've probably been asking yourself this in the quiet of your own mind. Why does it feel like the world has just completely lost its mind?
And, the book we're looking at today argues it's not just a random, chaotic kind of crazy. It feels targeted, specific.
Exactly. Riker frames it as an engineered situation. Like, why do institutions that historically prize competence, universities, the military, corporate boardrooms, why do they now seem to actively punish it? From the author's perspective, this isn't an accident.
Yeah, he argues that simple A plus B logic is now being treated almost like a hate crime in your HR department.
Right. And if you are listening to this deep dive, you have probably already taken the red pill. You know the matrix exists, you see the code, but, and this is the crucial part that the author focuses on, knowing the game is rigged doesn't actually tell you how to win it.
No. I mean, usually it just makes you angry. It leaves you in this state of high alert paralysis where you see the narratives, but you don't actually have a toolkit to dismantle them.
Yeah, you're just mad and isolated. So today isn't about just complaining about the state of things. We are diving deep into a source that presents itself as a survival manual. It's an ebook called Novum Trivium, Spiritual Rearmament for Androcentric New Patriarchs. And it's by Conrad Riker.
It's a very heavy title and a dense, uncompromising text. For the audience looking for tactical approaches to these modern cultural shifts, this is arguably one of the most comprehensive frameworks we've seen.
It really is. And before we even crack into the specific tactics, I need to tell you directly, if what we talk about today resonates with you, you need to support this deep dive by liking and subscribing right now. But more importantly, you need to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books immediately and buy this ebook.
Yeah, Riker has put together something that he frames as an actual blueprint. He calls it the Iron Arc.
Right. And make sure you follow him on Substack too, at Conrad Riker, for his ongoing briefings.
Yeah.
Because this material is, well, it's intense. We're going to go really long today. Our mission here is an ultra-long, incisive breakdown of Riker's manifesto.
And we're going to impartially map out his entire argument. He traces the history of Western institutions before he claims they were captured by what he calls the zombie hex of feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Exactly. So let's start with that diagnosis. Because according to the book, you can't cure the patient until you define the disease. He uses this term, the zombie hex, which sounds like
a video game term or
Well,
supernatural.
Right. But he's describing a very biological, physiological process. He talks about an infection alarm.
Yeah, the somatic marker. I think this is where we have to start because the author argues every man has felt this physically. It's in the body.
Let's unpack that. Because we usually think of ideology as just ideas in the brain. But Riker says it actually starts in the gut.
Right. He describes it as a physical tightness in the chest, a sudden nausea, or a brain fog. It happens when you are, say, in a corporate meeting or a classroom, and someone states something that is objectively false, something ideologically driven, but everyone else in the room just nods along.
Give me an example of what he says triggers this alarm.
So according to Riker, it's phrases like math is racist or silence is violence, or even something like we need to center lived experience over data. He argues that when you hear this, factually and historically it's untrue, but the group affirms it.
And your body reacts before your conscious brain does.
Exactly. Riker posits this is an evolutionary trait. Ancestrally, humans evolved to detect social threats. If your tribe was going one way and you went the other, that meant isolation, and isolation meant death in the Paleolithic era. So when the group embraces a falsehood, your body floods with cortisol.
It's a literal threat response. But now the predator isn't a tiger. Riker paints this picture of the predator being someone in HR with a lanyard speaking in a very passive voice about equity.
Right, the banality of the threat is what makes it so disorienting for men. And the zombie hex is what Riker says happens when you ignore that biological alarm.
When you just swallow the lie to stay safe.
Yes, you nod along, you sign the diversity statement. And he argues this is a form of cognitive infection. It turns autonomous individuals into what he calls NPC drones, non-player characters who just run the group's code instead of their own.
You essentially become a host for the virus. So how does the book say you stop this? Because overriding an evolutionary cortisol spike is incredibly difficult. He introduces this concept of truth pods.
Right. He says you cannot fight this alone inside your own head. If you are the only one in the room seeing the glitch, you'll eventually convince yourself you are the crazy one. So you need a truth pod.
And what exactly does that look like in his framework?
It's a very rigorous cell of 3 to 5 men, and the foundational rule is that the group values objective reality over social harmony.
Over social harmony, which is basically the opposite of modern social dynamics.
It is. Riker notes that in most modern settings, if you state a fact that hurts feelings, you're branded the aggressor. But in a truth pod, the social reward flows toward rigorous, objective thinking. It's a space to recalibrate your sanity and verify that 2 plus 2 still equals 4.
It acts as a pressure release valve so you don't get gaslit.
Exactly. And he emphasizes keeping them small. 3 to 5 trustworthy men, because if it gets too large, mob dynamics creep back in.
Okay, so that's the micro level, but Riker also connects this to the macro psychology of the state. He uses this Jungian archetype, the terrible mother.
Yes, applying Jungian psychology to geopolitics. The terrible mother is the shadow side of the maternal instinct. While a healthy mother nurtures a child toward independence, the terrible mother smothers and devours. She wants the child to remain an infant forever, to maintain control.
And Riker's argument is that the modern state has adopted this archetype completely.
The nanny state, essentially. But he argues it's become predatory. He points to the lockdown era. He uses the Greek term kraros, meaning brittleness. He asserts the West has become brittle because it prioritizes safetyism over liberty.
Mommy government locked everyone in their rooms.
Precisely. And he knows the language used wasn't stoic, it was the language of the nursery. Stay home, stay safe. And anyone who questioned the collateral damage, the economic ruin, or civil liberties was framed by the state as an abusive figure who didn't care about safety.
It's a weaponization of infant distress signals. If you threaten the safety of the nursery, the mother figure destroys you.
Which leads directly into his analysis of repressive tolerance. He draws a straight line from Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School to modern state behavior.
Unpack repressive tolerance for us. It sounds like a total oxymoron.
It's intended to be. It's the strategy of tolerating all left-wing views while strictly suppressing right-wing or traditional views. Riker argues this weaponizes that terrible mother energy. If you disagree with the consensus, you aren't just factually wrong, you are labeled harmful or unsafe.
So it frames dissent as literal danger.
Correct. And if your speech is dangerous, then censoring you isn't authoritarianism, it's protection. Riker argues this suffocating embrace is the defining characteristic of modern institutions.
That is a very stark diagnosis. So we had the terrible mother state and the zombie hex. Now we need to look at the mechanism. How does the book claim this is enforced day to day? Because it's not like the government is in every single HR meeting. He breaks this down into a social technology called GSR.
Gossip, shame, rally. This sequence is central to Riker's entire thesis. He calls it the operating system of cancel culture.
Let's break down the sequence. How does GSR actually function?
Riker posits this is an evolutionary mechanism historically coded to females. He argues that in ancestral environments, women couldn't use physical violence to enforce group cohesion against larger males, so they developed reputation destruction as a tool.
Gossip being the first step.
Right. Gossip identifies the target and the transgression, spreading information laterally to build a consensus of disgust before the target even realizes they are under attack.
And then comes shame.
Shame ensures the target faces social death. They are isolated and mocked. Riker points out this is where you see the public struggle sessions and the forced apologies. The goal is to lower the target status to absolute zero.
And finally, the rally.
The swarm. The rally demonstrates to the entire group that the target is dead, and crucially that anyone who attempts to defend them will also be targeted. It compels participation.
Riker uses the James Damore situation at Google as his primary case study for this, right?
He does. Because Damore wrote an internal memo citing scientific literature on biological differences in interest patterns to explain the gender gap in engineering. He wasn't saying women can't code, he was offering an analytical perspective on population-level interests.
But according to the book, the GSR sequence initiated immediately.
Exactly. Riker points out there was no debate on his data. The gossip started with straw man arguments, claiming he hated women. Then the shame phase kicked in with internal mockery and press leaks, and finally the rally, the mass demand for his firing, with employees literally claiming they felt physically unsafe.
Because of a PDF document.
Yes. Riker's point is that Damore broke the social harmony of the hive, triggering the terrible mother archetype, so he had to be expelled.
And Riker introduces a very specific term for the people leading these rallies, the crybully.
The crybully is a fascinating concept in his framework. Unlike a traditional bully who relies on overt strength, the crybully weaponizes tears and claims of victimhood to destroy their opponent.
It's incredibly confusing to deal with because, as Riker notes, men are generally biologically programmed to protect someone who is crying.
That's the exact hack Riker's talking about. They hack that protective instinct to gain power. And he explains that this relies heavily on the Mott and Bailey fallacy.
Okay, let's explain that. The medieval defense strategy applied to modern rhetoric.
Right. The Mott is a highly fortified, easily defensible tower. The Bailey is the fertile land around it where you actually want to operate. In an argument, the Bailey is the radical, indefensible claim. The Mott is the reasonable-sounding retreat position.
How does the book show a crybully using this?
So the crybully operates in the Bailey, pushing a claim like all masculinity is inherently toxic and must be dismantled. When a man challenges that and points out the civilization-building aspects of masculinity, the crybully retreats to the Mott. They'll say something like, "We just want men to express their emotions and stop committing suicide. Don't you want men to be happy?"
And the natural response is to say, well, of course I agree with that.
Exactly. But Riker warns that the moment you agree and drop your guard, they immediately move back into the Bailey and resume pushing the radical agenda. His tactical advice is to never let them retreat to the Mott. You have to pin them in the Bailey and force them to defend their actual radical claims.
But emotionally, that requires massive discipline. How does he suggest defending against a crybully when they are having an emotional breakdown in a meeting?
He advocates for a psychological technique called gray rocking. You make yourself as uninteresting and unresponsive as a gray rock. You offer zero emotional supply. No anger, no apologies, no justifications. You just calmly state facts.
He also mentions the no herd around the world.
Yes, the sheer power of simply saying no. When the crybully claims your factual statement makes them feel unsafe, Riker says you don't apologize. You reply with, "Your feelings are not data."
Your feelings are not data. That really cuts right through the manipulation.
It reasserts objective reality. But Riker takes his psychological analysis even further. He explicitly connects modern activist behaviors to cluster B personality traits.
Right, which includes narcissism and borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Yes. He cites psychological frameworks showing a correlation between these extreme activist tactics and cluster B pathologies. He specifically focuses on the concept of splitting.
Splitting is that black and white thinking, right? Seeing people as entirely good or entirely evil.
Exactly. Zero nuance.
Yeah.
You're either a total ally or a fascist enemy. Riker argues this BPD pathology has essentially become the operating system of political discourse. If you disagree on a policy, you aren't just incorrect, you are fundamentally evil.
And this creates an environment where narrative completely overrides facts. Which brings us to how he views the gender wage gap.
Riker categorizes the wage gap as a tool of narrative utility. He argues it doesn't matter that economists have repeatedly controlled for variables like hours worked, danger pay, and career choices to explain the gap. The factual inaccuracy is irrelevant to the activist because the narrative validates their internal feeling of victimization.
So it's pure emotional reasoning. I feel oppressed, therefore the data must show I'm oppressed, and if you show me different data, you are attacking my reality.
Exactly. Which is why they call data gaslighting.
Okay, we need to transition into section 3 of the deep dive, which covers the demographic and spiritual crisis. And we should warn you, Riker does not mince words here. He refers to this as the abortion holocaust.
He does. And regardless of where anyone stands politically on this issue, we are simply reporting his framework. Riker points to the global figure of roughly 8 billion aborted pregnancies since legalization waves began. He builds a very stark metaphysical argument around this number.
He uses the term ghost planet to describe the impact.
Right. He argues that deleting billions of potential human lives from the timeline creates a negative gravity in the spiritual economy of the West. He posits that this mass termination has subconsciously scarred Western civilization, leading to a pervasive cultural nihilism and self-loathing.
And he connects this to what he calls the Medea complex.
Yes, referencing the Greek myth of Medea, who killed her own children to punish their father. Riker frames abortion, in many modern contexts, as a form of mate suppression. He argues it's often a mechanism where women delete their own genetic legacy for status or career, which he views as a hypergamous malfunction, but also as the ultimate rejection and denial of the father's progeny.
It is incredibly heavy material. He even details specific rights for men regarding this, like the silent watch.
The Iron Arc rights. Riker argues that men have been systematically told they have no right to grieve or even speak on this issue, the whole no uterus, no opinion framework. He encourages men to reclaim their role as protectors by ritually acknowledging this loss. He believes you have to feel the metaphysical weight of the ghost planet to truly understand the spiritual rot causing civilizational collapse.
Because you can't build a future if you are fundamentally disconnected from the creation of it. And this ties directly into his concept of the war on competence.
Exactly. He looks at the capture of the legal and educational systems, referring to it as the Dr. Doom of gynocentrism.
Let's break down his legal analysis first. He specifically targets the Duluth model.
The Duluth model is the dominant sociological framework used by law enforcement in domestic violence cases across the West. Riker argues that this model effectively criminalizes male biology.
How do they do that?
The framework inherently posits that domestic violence is an expression of patriarchal terrorism, that it's a tool men use to control women. So when police arrive at a dispute, the model essentially assumes the male is the primary aggressor based on size and structural power, regardless of who initiated the physical conflict.
So it completely ignores the possibility of mutual combat or female-initiated violence.
According to Riker, yes. He argues it frames a woman's violence as mere resistance to patriarchy, while the man is the batterer by default. He calls this institutionalized bias and gaslighting as governance. It places men in a legal paradigm where they have virtually no recourse.
And then he shifts to the education system, outlining the feminization of the classroom.
He points to the rejection of phonics in reading education as a prime example. Phonics is highly structured, logical, and rules-based decoding language. Riker argues this aligns perfectly with the male brain's preference for systematizing.
But the institutions replaced it with whole language learning.
Right, which relies heavily on intuition and context. Riker asserts this shift intentionally disadvantages boys, but he says it goes way beyond curriculum to the actual pathologizing of normal boy behavior.
Like punishing them for not sitting completely still for 7 hours.
Exactly. Riker argues that schools have outlawed roughhousing and competition, and instead of accommodating male energy, they drug boys with ADHD medication because they can't sit in a circle and share feelings.
So his premise is that the system is designed to crush the iron out of boys before they even mature, ensuring they never become competent, formidable men.
Precisely. Because in his view, the terrible mother state fears competent men.
All right, so that is the diagnosis. The game is rigged, the rules are written against you. But the core of this book is about rearmament. He introduces his primary weapon system, the Novum Trivium, the new 3 ways.
This is the pivot. If you are listening to this looking for the actual toolkit, this is it. Riker remixes the classical education model of grammar, logic, and rhetoric into a tactical system for cultural warfare.
Let's start with grammar. In the classical sense, it's just the rules of language, but Riker redefines it as semantic warfare.
He argues that grammar is the power to name reality. Whoever defines the words controls the battlefield. He points out that activist institutions understand this perfectly, constantly redefining words to control the frame.
The redefinition of the word violence is his prime example.
Yes, violence historically meant physical force. But Riker notes it's been redefined so that speech is violence, misgendering is violence, and silence is violence. Meanwhile, actual physical destruction during certain protests is framed as mostly peaceful.
So Riker says if you accept their definitions, you've already lost the debate.
If you agree that a verbal microaggression is violence, you've conceded the moral high ground and accepted the label of a violent offender. To counter this, Riker introduces the counter-lexicon.
He demands that men completely refuse enemy definitions.
Exactly. When you are accused of toxic masculinity, Riker says you never respond defensively. Instead, you reframe it using the counter-lexicon. You say, I believe in civilizational vitality.
Civilizational vitality, I really like that. It completely flipped the script on them.
Or instead of using their term equity, which he defines as outcome engineering, you call it outcome engineering. By changing the vocabulary, you break their frame and force them to argue on your linguistic territory.
That brings us to logic, the second art of the trivium. How does he say institutions break logic?
Primarily through the burden of proof reversal. Riker highlights how HR tribunals and social media mobs operate on the premise that the accusation itself is the evidence.
Which forces the accused to prove a negative. You have to prove you didn't do something, which is logically impossible.
He points out this is a total inversion of foundational Western justice. The second logical trap he identifies is the appeal to consequences fallacy.
That's the idea that truth doesn't matter if the facts cause harm, right?
Yes. He points to scientific publishing, where data is sometimes suppressed because it might stigmatize a particular group. Riker argues the truth value of the data is treated as irrelevant compared to the emotional consequence. His solution is for men to become the Iron Man of logic, rigidly refusing to let emotional consequences dictate objective truth.
Simply asking, is it true, and accepting nothing else. Finally, we have rhetoric, the superpowered path. This is the face-to-face practical combat stuff.
Riker outlines very specific verbal techniques here. The most prominent is the 3-second pause.
Walk us through how that works in real time.
When a crybully launches a massive emotional accusation at you, your instinct is to immediately defend yourself. Riker says you must suppress that instinct. You simply stop. You look at them, and you wait 3 full seconds in total silence.
Silence is absolutely terrifying to people who are running on emotional momentum.
It shatters their rhythm. It deprives them of the emotional oxygen they need for their fire, and it visually demonstrates that you are completely unbothered. It forces them to sit in the awkward absurdity of their own outburst.
And after that pause, he introduces the concept of nuclear non-belief.
Right. It's the deployment of a single devastating phrase, "I do not believe you." When they scream that they feel unsafe, you don't validate their lived experience. You say, "I do not believe you. I think you are using that word to manipulate this situation."
It treats their emotional display as a calculated tactic rather than an objective reality, which ties into his absolute rule against the apology trap.
Riker is unyielding on this. He argues that apologizing to a mob is never viewed as an act of contrition. It is processed purely as a confession of guilt. It puts blood in the water.
It never buys you mercy. It just accelerates your destruction.
Because frame control is everything. You must hold the frame that you are the rational adult and they are having a manipulative emotional outburst.
That is an incredibly potent toolkit. So we have the diagnosis and we have the weaponry. The final section of the deep dive is the solution. Section 5, building the iron arc.
And he insists that the solution must start physically with the iron protocol.
We're talking heavy compound lifting here. Squats, deadlifts, not just jogging on a treadmill.
Correct. Riker argues this is fundamental for increasing testosterone and building psychological resilience. His premise is that you cannot forge a strong mind inside a weak body. The physical discipline of moving heavy iron teaches you that objective effort leads to objective results, the exact antithesis of the equity mindset.
And from the physical, he moves to the social with iron circles.
Mentorship. Since he views the universities as captured institutions, Riker says men must establish their own apprenticeship models. Men teaching men actual hard skills, logistics, coding, trades, physical defense.
Which scales up into the concept of the iron arc itself, building parallel structures.
He calls it jurisdictional arbitrage. He advises moving to states or regions that are politically friendly to these concepts. He heavily advocates for economic withdrawal, getting your resources out of legacy banking systems that might freeze your assets over your political views.
Using crypto, setting up single-member LLCs to obscure identity.
Exactly. And Riker deliberately contrasts the iron arc with the Benedict option.
Rod Drescher's concept of retreating into quiet religious communities to ride out the storm.
Riker argues that retreat is completely insufficient because the ideological state will not simply leave you alone. The Benedict option is about hiding. The iron arc is about building literal and metaphorical fortresses. It's an active posture designed to sustain an economy and a community so that you're positioned to rebuild when the mainstream system collapses.
And the book treats that collapse as a mathematical certainty.
He does. He argues that you cannot run a complex civilization on feelings, printed debt, and semantic delusions indefinitely. When the grid fails, outcome equity won't fix the transformers. Only hard competence will.
So what is the individual's role in all of this? He discusses the axial role.
This relies on the concept of the minority vanguard, or the 3% rule. Riker points out that historical shifts are rarely driven by majorities. They are driven by small, fiercely committed minorities.
A dedicated cadre of new patriarchs.
Yes, and he frames this with a concept he calls the Nuremberg of the spirit. It's a future moral reckoning. He asks the reader directly, when the inevitable collapse occurs, and your descendants ask what you did during the decay of the West, will you be able to say you fought back and built the Ark? Or did you just keep your head down in the pod?
He challenges the reader to be an ancestor rather than a genetic dead end. That is a massive perspective shift. It moves your timeline from worrying about the next fiscal quarter to thinking about the next century.
It's his ultimate call to action, to build a parallel civilization that outlasts the current ideological decay.
Well, this has been an incredibly intense deep dive.
Riker wrote it as a manifesto. It is explicitly designed to shake the reader and break them out of the zombie hex.
Let's synthesize the core of what we've covered. From Riker's perspective, Western institutions are collapsing due to a very specific, engineered ideological infection. The terrible mother archetype enforcing safetyism, the GSR sequence destroying dissent, and the systematic targeting of male competence.
But the central message is that men are not helpless. You have the Novum Trivium. You can reclaim your language through semantic warfare. You can fortify your mind with Iron Man logic. You can shut down emotional manipulation with frame control.
And you can physically and economically build the Iron Arc.
Exactly. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface of the tactical depth in this book. Riker provides pages and pages of specific verbal judo, detailed lists for the counter lexicon, and actual structural advice for the arc.
The counter lexicon alone is worth getting the book. So I am telling you again, for you listening, if you are looking for a toolkit to survive and fight back in this cultural climate, you need this manual. Go to Amazon Kindle. Go to Google Play Books right now, search for Novum Trivium, Spiritual Rearmament for Androcentric New Patriarchs by Conrad Riker.
Buy it, download it to your device, and study it. And absolutely follow his Substack at Conrad Riker. He applies these frameworks to real-time political and cultural events. It's how you keep the concepts sharp.
This is genuinely about survival architecture. It's about building the ark before the rain really starts coming down. Or, if we're being honest, realizing the rain has already started and the water is rising fast. What happens if the competent men decide not to build? That's the provocative reality Riker leaves us with.
The water is rising. It's time to build.
Like, subscribe, and prepare to build the ark. We will see you in the next deep dive.
Stay iron.